Hello, everybody, and welcome to HR Profile's second webinar of 2016. This is the second in a series of 6 HR Profile educational webinars. HR Profile is committed to partnering with the human resources community in providing these talks to help round out your education and even provide the SHRM and HRCI credits for you. My name is Sonia McLaughlin, and I'm the client advocate here at HR Profile. I'll be your facilitator for today's webinar. My contact information is on the slide, so please feel free to reach out if you need some additional information. Today we're going to learn a few of the important government agencies and types of searches appropriate for your employment screening needs. More specifically, we're going to go over OIG, GSA, OFAC, global watch lists, and others. First, we're going to have a little bit of housekeeping. If you've got any questions during the webinar, you should have a question chat box. Go ahead and type them in there, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. If there's any kind of a problem, you can also feel free to communicate with me in the chat box and select your message go just to me. If your question doesn't get answered during the time allotted, all the questions and answers will be included in our follow-up emails. With that, let me introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Nicholas Sakalis. Mr. Sakalis joined HR Profile in June of 1999 as Manager of Information Systems. He continued to serve in that capacity for the firm until May of 2001, when he was promoted to General Manager. As GM, Mr. Sakalis oversaw operations, was intricately involved with every aspect of production. Then in 2005, Mr. Sakalis became the Director of Information Systems to focus on the growing needs of our clients. Mr. Sakalis enjoys the day-to-day challenges in the IT community and especially enjoys developing innovative solutions that make our clients' jobs more efficient. Furthermore, he has deep subject matter expertise relative to compliance and has helped our customers extensively in that regard. I'm going to hand it over now to Nick to teach us about the OIG, GSA, global watch lists, and others. Here's Nick.
Thank you, Sonia. As mentioned, today's objective is indeed to discuss the wild world of debarment and the blacklist that exists in our country and others. We'll sort out the craziness of all those letters and alphabet soup, and we'll move on to understand how those searches are conducted. And in the end, understand how these relate to your screening process. Let's start with a few key terms it's going to be necessary to understand and delineate. The word blacklist, generally speaking, is someone or something that is not in the favor of another. Now, a blacklist generally means a form of debarment. You've been debarred from participating, belonging to this, that, or the other. Debarments generally can be thought of as exclusions. You've been excluded from the above. Sanctions is a little bit of a variation on that. So a sanction generally is the first step toward possible exclusion. It's a lesser issue. It's not as severe. So in other words, exclusions can be thought of as a severe form of sanctions, meaning sanctions lead toward exclusions in many cases. And exclusions can be sometimes at the civil level or at the criminal level, depending on severity. The OIG and the GSA lists, or those organizations, tend to use the term sanction when really they should be using the word exclusions, because that's what their lists contain. Sanctions falls in a different arena in background check. We also want to discuss the difference between primary source and proprietary databases. And we'll get to that later in the slides. But it's important to understand that a primary source is the direct originator of the data. And oftentimes the primary source is the most reliable place for that data, most up-to-date, most reliable, but not always the most convenient. The proprietary databases help pick up where those leave off, meaning that they're a little more cost-effective, time-effective, but not necessarily always up-to-date. So used in conjunction, primary and proprietary, usually is what's necessary to get the job done correctly. Please know that everything I'm going to tell you today is not meant to serve as legal advice. It is for informational purposes only, but we'll get pretty deep into it, hopefully. So indeed, the alphabet soup. There are a lot of acronyms, a lot of letters, a lot of terms, a lot of phrases. Of course, when you're doing business with the government, you expect that. Our goal today is to narrow all this down to basically just 4 searches, maybe even less in some cases. So you'll see some terms on here that I'll cover almost all of them. If there are any that are striking your fancy and you want me to speak to them, let us know. Like, for instance, the Homeland Security Presidential Directive, HSPD-6, will be covered toward the end. I will not necessarily speak to it directly, except to say that it's included toward the end of the program. So let's sort this all out. So from the alphabet soup, we can distill it down into this screen for the purposes of this lecture. As you'll see, the OIG GSA that you hear about most often, there at the top of the screen, first 2 listed, originate from the Health and Human Services Division, Department of the Government, Federal Government, and the GSA as well. Sometimes the OFAC, people refer to their list as the terrorist watch list, is an outsourcing of the U.S. Treasury Office. And then the proprietary databases pick up all the other remaining alphabet soups, tend to fall into that area. We'll go through each one individually. We're going to spend the majority of our time talking about the OIG, as that's the one source for most of what we're covering today. It is the place where things begin and end a lot for what we're going to cover. First, know that there are many OIGs, not just one OIG. One basically for each department or agency in the federal government. Pertinent to our topic matter today is the OIG for Health and Human Services. It's a large organization, this particular OIG, with about 11 departments and about 1,600 employees, and they're recruiting all the time. In fact, on their website, you'll find they're recruiting interns for positions at the federal and state level. They do have the 2 tiers, federal and state, meaning that Medicare and Medicaid offices are found at the state level. And those individual offices govern the behavior of the state and can produce sanctions and exclusions and debarments in those individual states. Theoretically, the states are supposed to report up to the federal level, but in reality, about 40% of their records are not making it to the federal list. This, of course, poses an interesting problem in that now you find yourself needing to do searches at both the state and federal level to get a full search. The other part of the theory is that if you're excluded in one state, you should be excluded in all states. So hopefully your state search finds exclusions that happen maybe in a different state. This becomes more important, of course, when you're dealing with traveling nurses and other such referring physicians, et cetera, who are licensed in multiple states. The search itself can be performed directly at the OIG website, listed at the bottom of that screen. It is a name search. With that name search, hopefully for the individuals, when you're doing individual searches, you can use a social security number as a further identifier. Not always available. Makes it tricky. Have to dig deeper. Gets a little more complicated. There is the option of downloading their list. If you do download the current list, there are about 63,000 rows of names, individuals, and entities. So that makes for an interesting search if you have to do it. They're always adding more names. In fact, 234 are being added just in March alone. Understand that the OIG oversees more than 300 Health and Human Service programs, including those from the Centers for Disease Control, the NIH, National Institute of Health, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. They're doing a great job, by the way, and that they're recouping billions of dollars every year, billions with a B. They do, the search can include just about anyone in the organization. It can be the direct care providers themselves, all the way down to janitorial services. Know that there are many different types of activities that lead up to an exclusion, and the different types determine what type of exclusion will be the end result. Anything from suspension, revoking of a license, that's the one we see most commonly when we find people on the list. Patient abuse, unlawful kickbacks, it's a fun one, and of course, financial fraud and abuse. Remember, the concept here is that folks are trying to get reimbursed from Medicare, Medicaid, and the OIG's job in HHS is to help regulate those reimbursements. It is all part of a Social Security Administration function, of course, hence the legal right for civil and criminal charges. Of all these different types of activities, fraud and abuse represent the majority, about 3/4 of them actually. So remember, sanctions lead to exclusions, and exclusions lead to civil and criminal charges. As a side note, we're still waiting for criminal charges to be brought against many Wall Street firms, but that's not a Health and Human Service OIG matter, and not one for this lecture today. The exclusions can fall under, as I mentioned, 2 types, depending on which type was performed. There's the permissive type. It's the lesser one. It's more of a misdemeanor level conviction type. Usually covers about a 1 to 3 exclusion period, 1 to 3 year exclusion period, up to about 5 years, no more. The courts decide the penalties in that case. And then there's the mandatory ones. So certain behaviors and activities will land you on the mandatory list. Those are the more severe, more felony level type. They carry a minimum 5-year exclusion, could go as much as indefinite. And those penalties are mandated by law, hence the name. The fines can be quite severe. They can be as much as $10,000 per item claimed. They can be extra penalties of 3 times a multiple of the claim. They can lead to possible additional penalties, $11,000 per claim. They can lead to possible exclusion. They could possibly lead to criminal charges and jail time. And they certainly could lead to what's referred to as the corporate integrity agreement. There are a couple different kinds of CIA corporate integrity agreements. We won't cover all those today for the sake of time. But some are a little easier to deal with than others. Some are a little more severe. That's where you don't necessarily want to end up. To not end up there means that you may have the possibility of self-disclosure. So self-disclosure means that you've discovered something might have been slipped through the cracks and you're now doing business with somebody from a debarment list. And the OIG issues a guide to self-disclosure to say, hey, come forth, admit to the issue. We'll help you deal with it. It's a nicer path to go than waiting for us to discover it. If we discover it, it's not going to be so nice. If you do so, it's about a 12-month period to go through that self-disclosure process. Definitely less onerous than the time and resources required they discover it. Next, let's cover the role of the GSA and its list known as the EPLS. The GSA itself, General Services Administration, was created in 1949, post-World War II, as an attempt to streamline and consolidate multiple parts of the government when you're doing business with the government. It is the organization that governs the contracts you have with your government. The concept is, meaning for their list, the department list, is that if you're not supposed to do business or purchase goods or services from an entity that's been excluded by the federal government. So the theory was that the GSA is supposed to maintain and be the single source of debarred individuals or entities. Now, as the GSA itself does not have authority to levy fines, etc., the actual agency involved is the organization that's supposed to report the debarment to the GSA. So they serve as the repository for other lists, should be consolidated into one list, known as the Excluded Parties List System. The reality is that we find folks on one list but not theirs, should be on theirs, doesn't exist, hence the need to do these multiple list searches. Thank you. But there is a GSA list, of course, and that search can be performed directly on the GSA site, known as SAM, a new system they put up recently, a couple of years ago. When they first launched it, it was horrible. I went through a lot of revisions, much better now. It is a free search, but it's very cumbersome. It doesn't give a lot of verifiers. In fact, it's a name search. And with the name search, if you're lucky, you'll get an address. Oh, actually, almost all the time you get an address, but not always a useful address. So it becomes quite a bit of a chore to drill down to see if this particular individual or corporations aren't so tough, but individuals are tough to figure out if it belongs to yours or not. Oftentimes, the game here is to switch back to one of the originating sources. Remember, like I said, this is a repository. So this person should exist on some other list somewhere. And if you go back to that list, you might be able to then do something like a Social Security number verification to prove it's not your person. Cage codes have recently been added to the list. They're not useful yet, but hopefully they will be, especially when you're dealing with entities. Know that all US-based vendors are assigned a cage code when they register themselves in the SAM system. What's tricky about all this? What's tricky is that some vendors, meaning companies, can have multiple cage codes depending on different locations or facilities. So that hasn't proven out yet in practice. We're watching and waiting to see how that's going to play out. Just be aware of it for now. You know, a good background check will work for like the individuals with their addresses. They're going to work that address forward and backward to see who or has not lived at that address. It helps narrow down again, trying to get to whether this belongs to your candidate or not, or employee. When doing these searches, it is highly recommended that you do a last name, first initial search, so first name initials only, to get a broad result set, and then filter down that set to a targeted result set. It's just the best way to do it for this site, I can tell you. Also, when trying to verify whether this belongs to your candidate or not, licensing boards for those who are licensed individuals, professional licensed individuals, the licensing boards can provide additional verifiers. A good background check company knows to play that part of the game as well. That's the hard part, getting down to whether this belongs to your actual candidate or employee. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the fines can get pricey. In fact, on average, they're somewhere between $100,000 to $200,000. The law is clear about your responsibility to not do business with debarred individuals or entities. Again, sometimes you're going to be assessed civil fines, and sometimes it's going to reach the level of criminal penalties. So again, self-disclosure to show your willingness to compliance. And if you go that route, by the way, I did mention the benefit that it will reduce that multiplier, as I mentioned, 3 times each claim down to 1.5. And as I did mention, it takes about 12 months, which is much less time than the effort and aggravation when the OIG discovers it, or whatever the barring entity is. Next, let's tackle a different blacklist, which is less straightforward in its information source. That's why I like to use the word blacklist for it. So the U.S. Treasury Department agency created during World War II, but really harkens back to the early anti-money laundering laws of the early 20th century, and then the subsequent revisions to those laws in the 70s and the 80s. Of course, it really came into spotlight, and what it is, of course, is the list of folks that are viewed as a threat to U.S. security and well-being. Of course, it really came into spotlight, especially in the background check arena, during the post-9/11 era, when it started being referred to affectionately as the terrorist watch list. In truth, it's a consolidated list of about 29 others. You might want to contrast this list to the no-fly list, which is even more of a black box as to where it's to its source, possibly from the CIA or NSA, not really sure. And then the FBI's terrorist watch list, they have their own somewhat, there's of course crossover between these different lists. I think the FBI terrorist list is more of a domestic list only. It's not just terrorists on that list, of course. I think it's the list that's used for gun permits, by the way. As with the other searches, you can perform the search directly on their site, or they have a search pane, or you can download a data file, or you can download a PDF of the entire list. As mentioned, the list contains about 29 separate sanctions, all consolidated into one. You'll recognize some of those names: Cuba, Iran, Iraq. Hopefully Cuba will be removed soon. So note that 948 pages currently now for the list. The key being that when you do your searches on that document or in the file, data file, is to make sure you really focus also on the alias names portion of a listing. The reality is that many companies, background checks and others, have produced automated solutions to this. So they download the list as well, created their own repository database, do their searches. That's a little risky for some. What I mean to say is that we've seen that some of those fail, some of those proprietary solutions fail to find the AKA listings as the separate portion of the data. So they find the main listing name, but don't find the name in the alias section. So that's a little bit of a risk. So challenge your background check company if they're doing their own that way on that issue. So the names you'll recognize on that list for the corporate names, Halliburton, of course, as Halliburton is doing the world's dirty work, mostly, a lot. I believe, yeah, as recently as last month, they're on the list, I believe, for a Cuba sanction. The other thing to note is the reality that names that you know, like Johnson & Johnson, have subsidiaries. And those subsidiaries are sometimes hidden in the list as well. So it's a little tricky, got to do a little bit extra work, but if you take time to do the right search, you'll find them. Let's move on to the last type of search, and it is the proprietary database searches. It's here, as I mentioned before, that we're going to find most all the rest of the alphabet soup. In the electronic age, it's made it possible to create these database repositories, consolidating a multitude of various lists, etc., data, which are including, as it shows here, the FBI's most wanted, U.S. Marshals most wanted, Interpol's most wanted, ICE, the immigration control people, and also some specific industries, such as the Bureau of Industry and Security, which I believe was originally the Bureau of Industry and Standards, their denied list. So about 50 or so are oftentimes included on these lists. Only a few companies actually have this consolidated list. And the trick is to have them vetted. So the benefit, of course, is that you're doing, you got to go by, well, first of all, let me say, these lists are just made up names for these lists, right? Because they're a consolidated list, they're proprietary. So you'll see the made up names on occasion, like Global Watch List, or the Patriot Act Search, or Sanctioned Watch List Search. So all these various names, but they're all made up. There's no official government list that consolidates these. There are the individual lists, 50 plus or so. You can search each one of those if you'd like, but that's not terribly efficient. So the benefit being that with these lists comes a single search as opposed to the individual searches. The warning, though, as I'm mentioning, is to keep all those lists up to date with updates. So as a list is updated in its repository, and this is true for any of the ones we talked about up to this point, but for where people are downloading the lists, the game is to make sure that the latest list is included in the repository search. So therefore, if you're going to do a database search of some sort, as opposed to primary source, again, primary source, no risk in not being up to date, but tends to be intensive, time-consuming, cumbersome. So again, if you're going to do one of these database searches, there is risk, but there is cost and time effectiveness. So therefore, make sure you're using a trusted vendor of this database. HR Profile, being a background check company, does this as well, meaning we have several vendors that we also use in some proprietary database searches to conduct these multitude searches. And we can recommend those vendors to some of those clients who like to do want to tackle these searches on their own. We've already vetted those vendors. An example would be one that we vetted recently, where we challenged them to have the recent California Medicaid list. They did not, therefore they were cut out. So we did not use them, have not used them. A good vendor will welcome that kind of testing and any of those challenges. Your background check company should be performing those tasks of vetting. Some contracts require a search of these multitudes of lists. Sometimes just specific ones out of it, sometimes a few of them in combination. So when you have a contract that's requiring some of these searches, this is the way to go, yes. And your background check company can help determine if their list is compliant to your contracts. So as I mentioned, some specific industry searches are necessary. So for some companies, regulations and industry-specific guidelines dictate the need for very specific blacklist searches. For instance, in the world of airlines, the FAA has a debarred pilots list. You might not have known about that one. In finance world, there's about 5 lists, I think maybe 4, consolidated to 4, that are necessary in addition to other due diligence work you have to do in finance. So lists that are from the FDIC, the Federal Reserve Board, Office of Thrift Supervision, National Credit Union Administration, and the OCC, which is the comptroller of the currency. These are very specific searches that have to be performed for that industry. For some organizations, like food production, they have to show that they did the FDA list. The FDA list is supposed to be included on the GSA's list that we mentioned earlier, but some companies need to show in writing that they did the FDA specific blacklist. So again, specific industry concerns and guidelines. For healthcare industry, those adhering generally to the Joint Commission or JCO standards, a trusted and recommended vendor for performing blacklists is FACES. For FACES, there are 4 choices primarily, each one having its own little slant to fulfill a need for each organization. Some being single state searches based on your facility's location, some being a multi-state search of all the states involved, etc. Level 3 is an interesting one in that it deals with those individuals where you're dealing with licensed professionals, and they do the search against the licensing regulatory bodies. It's a nice search. Optionally, you can have what's referred to as the OFAC Plus, which is basically adding the OFAC terrorist list watch list with the proprietary Patriot Act global watch list is added. So that's an interesting addition as well, usually at no cost. Again, you can do direct, you can set up your own accounts with FACES, you can go direct with them. As I mentioned earlier, as with other vendors that we use in the background check community. Or your background check can do these searches, hopefully at a very reasonable cost, as a reseller of these services. In the end, let's talk about best practices. We think the first thing you should do if you're using a CRA is to challenge them on their subject matter expertise about these things. That concept of the intricacies of name variations and how each list should be searched and what it finds and how you verify against it, etc. Not a bad thing to challenge your CRA from time to time. Of course, you're going to want to do your pre-hires against these lists. You may not need to do all the lists. You may need to do all, or you might have to do all of them. If you do the list and somebody shows up on it from a pre-hire perspective, please know this is a really good time to kick in the Fair Credit Reporting Act's adverse action process. It might lead to rescinding the offer, or it might just lead to a candidate finding out that, oh, I didn't realize I was on a list still. I know I had the sanction. I thought it came off. Apparently it didn't. Some people don't know that once they've gotten on a list, that reinstatement is not automatic. They have to petition to be removed from the list. But adverse action certainly helps mitigate such issues. Again, might lead to the benefit of that candidate to find out that they're on the list. The Concept of pre-billing services, meaning you should run your vendors. As I said, you have a great responsibility not to do business with those who are on the list, the varmint list. And sometimes that search should also include the owners or principals of those companies as well. There's a general guideline about 5% ownership. Are they involved in operations or management of the company? Or be safe and do them anyway. It's up to you. The concept of running your current staff or vendors, which some companies do monthly, some actually do quarterly, some do yearly, can be per company policy if indeed you're showing willingness to compliance, or in the worst case scenario, you're under a corporate integrity agreement and you have to do them. So whether you do them or you can outsource these to your background check company or one of their vendors, it's a necessary piece. Again, somebody might show up. They weren't on it before you hired them, and now they're on it. It's an interesting reality. You know, when somebody is in the sanction mode, before the sanction happens, they do have an opportunity to plead their case. And that can take sometimes up to 12 months or even years. So while the event might have happened a while ago, they're just now showing up on the list. So when that happens, of course, you're going to want to deal with the remediation or possible termination at that point. It's all going to depend on what your status is at the time. So in summary, we've taken the alphabet soup and we've sorted it all out. You've learned about the acronyms and how they relate. The OIG having the federal and state levels. GSA having a list that's supposed to have everybody else's, but doesn't always. Where the OFAC's terrorist watch list comes into play for those of you doing business and hiring outside of the United States. And the proprietary databases and the tricks and traps that go with it, along with any industry-specific blacklists. So hopefully this helps sort it all out and gives you a little bit of an overview of how it all comes together. And with that,
awesome. Thank you so very much, Nick. That was very interesting and especially helpful in understanding this very complicated subject. We do have time for questions. I've got some already that have come through, and if anyone else has any other questions, please go ahead and type them up in your chat and question box. Let's see. Here are some of the questions. So is there not an actual single solitary list that we can go to?
Right. So as I mentioned, not. So crossover is supposed to occur. Doesn't, not even on the individual list themselves. The OIG is supposed to be consolidated from the states. It's not. The GSA is supposed to be consolidation of all those lists. It's not. So officially, meaning, is there an official list? No. Are there proprietary databases that pull them all together and get it down to a single search? Yes. But with that comes the risk of them not being up to date or being having direct source up-to-date information.
All right. Thank you. And then let's see. Here's one. If any of our hospital employees ends up on one of these lists, are they a criminal? Do we need to immediately let them go?
So the answer is no, not necessarily. Again, the good news is it begins with usually a sanction of some sort. With the sanction comes the ability to plead your case, work your way through it, get it taken care of, come off of it. So in some cases, sanctions lead to exclusions, exclusions lead to criminal. Hopefully it doesn't reach that level.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Are these excluded individuals and the specially designated nationals also on the no-fly list?
Right. So as I mentioned, the no-fly list, a bit of a mysterious list. I'm sure Wikipedia has something to say about it. I've not looked it up. But the no-fly list is closely guarded as to how people end up on that list. And again, as I mentioned, I would imagine the OFAC's terrorist list shows up on it. But it doesn't necessarily contain, like I said, the source is very guarded.
All righty. Let's see, we've got another question here. What is the difference between background checks with fingerprints and without fingerprints?
That's a great question. What's interesting about this topic, not just this topic, but as it relates to this seminar, is that there are times that we will see folks on these lists that aren't necessarily in the criminal portion of the background check. And of course, that might be obvious in the sense that people with sanctions against licensing isn't always a criminal offense, so therefore they're not going to show up in your criminal searches. But when it comes to fingerprinting, fingerprinting does not come into play with regards to this topic, but fingerprints do come into play when you're doing criminal searches wherein certain state repository, which are sometimes mandated for some industries, require fingerprint searches. Some states do not, and then an FBI search will always require a fingerprint search for employment purposes. So a background check does not always necessarily need a fingerprint to get the job done, as background checks are performed typically for pre-employment purposes direct to the county courts themselves. But as I mentioned, for certain industries, there are state regulations that state that you have to do the state repository, and those repositories, some are name searches, some are done online through their online systems, and some are fingerprint-based searches. And then those can even go on and include FBI. So an FBI sometimes is done directly for certain industries as well, highly regulated industries. Hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a lot to cover.
Oh, it's a whole other webinar.
Let's see. Here's one. What's the difference between the FACES levels and the OIG GSA excluded parties list?
Yes, if we're seeing that correct, which I think we are. The question's, yeah, I think we're seeing it correctly. So the difference between the FACES levels, right? So as I mentioned, and if you want, we can jump back to the slide. Perhaps you'll see it in the deck when we send the deck out afterward.
Can we jump back?
We can jump back.
Oh, there it is.
There
okay.
it is. So as you can see, the FACES level 1 does include the OIG, GSA, and the Food and Drug Administration list and other agency lists. As again, FACES was a company that was founded, it's private, it's a private company, private database, founded by former Department of Human Service OIG person. So it's very trusted. In fact, it's made itself trusted enough, as I mentioned, to become part of the JCO's best practices from the Joint Commission. But it is private. I mean, I think it's important to point that out, that they've made themselves self-important. That's okay. I'm okay with that, but the reality is that you could do the search directly to the OIG and GSA, and that is generally going to be enough for people in the healthcare industry to perform those two searches directly. And those are free. FACES is going to cost you. It's not going to cost a lot, but it's going to cost you. So you want to do it free, go direct to the government sources. If you want to do the single search through a private database, it's going to cost a little bit of money. It always does. Other questions?
Yeah, let's see. I think we still have a little time. Yep. Is there an up-to-date list for state background checks and fingerprint requirements?
That's an excellent question. Not really related to this topic, but I'll answer it for you. So an up-to-date list for background checks and fingerprinting requirements. So it depends on your industry. I cannot point you to a single source, meaning a website, that will give you that information. It's really up to the individual background check companies to be up to date on that. So whether you yourself as a corporation have information, your CRA, meaning your background check company, has that information, that's going to be the source, meaning for an up-to-date list. I don't know of a single place to go on the internet for such thing. There's many state licensing boards have a lot of links to other states that help make that happen. And there are some associations that help make that happen. In background check community itself, we have our own association, which is sort of a political action group. that helps keep us up to date, and there are other agencies and other organizations in our world that help keep us up to date on the different lists, on the different requirements. They're constantly changing, of course. So the answer is no, not a single list, but there are such lists.
Okay, thank you. And if anybody has any additional questions about any of these topics, you know,
Contact your CRA.
Absolutely. So let's see. Here's another question. Are consumer reporting agencies precluded from showing records in filter states that are over 7 years old? For example, if you're running excluded parties list in New York and the exclusion is over 7 years old, are CRAs allowed to report that? Does it follow the same rules as criminal records under the FCRA?
Another great question.
Yeah.
Let's break that down a little bit.
Okay.
So when a sanction is found, meaning you've searched the blacklist and you found somebody on the list, there are rules that have to be followed based on the, if you go back to primary source, meaning who's the originating agency for it. Each agency has its own guidelines that have to be followed for when somebody shows up on the list. So does the CRA need to report it? The answer is yes, they need to address it and possibly report it, depending on how the conversation goes with the originating agency. So, and often, I remember one particular case where it was necessary for us to go back to the original agency, have them pull the original letters that were generated surrounding the abuse, try to find that original case in the court system because it ended up in a criminal conviction, try to find out how it was disposed, and then from that disposition determine how it affects the pre-employment decision-making of hire or non-hire and adverse action. So if it can be validated that it's a solved case, it's been resolved, then you can adhere to adverse action if you want the candidate to be aware of their presence on the list still, but not affect your decision necessarily to not hire or to hire. So complicated question. I would have to break that down a little bit more again. It's going to take too much time in this lecture, I'm afraid.
Okay, let's see. What else do we have here? And then, should we just have time for one more question?
Go for it.
Okay. Let's see. So, if the GSA list, does that apply to just people and companies barred from doing business with just government contracts and public funding? Or does it also bar people, private people and businesses from doing business with those companies?
I think I understand. Let's look at it again.
The GSA.
The department list, yeah.
Does it apply to just companies doing business with federal contracts and the government, or also private companies without federal money, government money?
Right. So the concept there is that you're doing business with each other, company to company, business to business. And the question is, if the work you're doing is not government work, can you do business with each other? I believe that's the question.
Yeah, I think so. That sounds like it.
So the answer is that you can, but of course you do so with some risk.
Okay.
Because if you enter into government contracts at that point, then you're dealing with companies you shouldn't be doing business with, right? So.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Let's get back to we went through these and we did a little bit of wrap up. I said we're going to have time for today. We're going to wrap up, and thank you very much, Nick.
You're welcome.
And we sincerely hope everyone on this call has a better understanding of the OIG, GSA, OFAC, and those proprietary databases. Nick's contact information is on the presentation, as well as mine. I'll send it all out in emails to you all with your credit certificates, slide deck, links to this video, our website, and our upcoming webinars, where you can go ahead and register now. And a quick note as we conclude, I want to be sure to convey that on top of lining up these informative webinars and continuing education credits, it's my job to make sure that there's no question in your mind that HR Profile is a valuable resource for you as one of the nation's preeminent consumer reporting agencies. We provide thorough and high-quality background checks and employment screening services. So also, our next upcoming webinar is Wednesday, May 16th, when Personnel Profiles will be discussing how to assess your assessments. You can find out more information again on our website, www.hrprofile.com. And please don't hesitate to contact me directly if you have any additional questions. And lastly, on behalf of all of us here at HR Profile, thank you for attending today.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.